with a newly independent frame, many of the new states in the United States of America, after they'd been declared, would begin to officially create their own state governments. And even though talks were to begin about creating a national government that would eventually take place, many of the states wanted to repudiate the old British rule that had existed. They wanted to do away with the idea of there being a European aristocracy that controlled everything and everybody else were a bunch of peasants, kind of like in a feudalist style. They wanted to do away with that. They also wanted to do away with there being a tyrannical king or perhaps a parliamentarian or any sort of executive that could be tyrannical and overstep their powers. So you have a number of state governments that espouse the idea of republicanism. And a republican form of government is one that is elected and powered by the people, not vice versa. But it's also one that comes with a system of checks and balances that we'll talk about later on. So you want a more democratic style, but in this time, a republican form. So you reduce the powers of an executive and you eliminate the idea of there being this feudalist aristocracy where a very few control everything. So Thomas Jefferson idealized the rural lifestyle. He believed that Americans should have this independent mindset of a yeoman farmer, self-sustaining, small, independent movement, but free nonetheless. And he really liked the virtues of people not relying on their government or their government not being tyrannical so as to overstep their bounds. Okay? So he liked that idea of a basic small landowner, free to do whatever, who can create their own lifestyles for themselves. And in that instance, you create this sort of political virtue to where you have a government that works for the people, not the other way around. So, another part of that concept, though, a republican form of concept in government, is noted in the Declaration of Independence itself that Thomas Jefferson wrote. And that is that all men are created equal. Okay? All men are created equal is a brilliant statement that has power that rings true to this day. It's in reference to the idea that nobody's better than one another. You each have an equal opportunity to ascend, mobilize, socialize, and improve your lot in life. If you don't like your lot in life, you can move. You can try something else. You have the freedom to do as you please so as to improve your station in life. And that would ring true for generations to this day. Okay? It's a powerful rhetorical framework, if you will. All men are created equal. Okay? And it's going to set a standard for those claiming rights in America. You have the right, as the Independence Declaration also says, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal. Okay? Here's the thing. When the Declaration of Independence was written, it was largely meant that, yeah, all men are created equal. All white men are created equal. Okay? Again, let's not be guilty of presentism by looking through today's lens at yesterday's history. Okay? Back in 1776, times were very different. Doesn't excuse anything, but it was a different time and a different era when that was written. Women, still in the old British style, did not have rights. Black people at that time were largely slaves. And you had Native Americans at that time who were starting to come to terms with the white settlement onslaught. Okay? We know now that if we are to truly have an equal and free society, that's got to be everybody. That can't just be a certain segment. Even if it's a large segment, that needs to be everybody. And that's a conversation that we have to this day, that's things that have happened, especially in the coronavirus era, where you have various different uprisings and Black Lives Matter movements and women's movements and gay rights and all kinds of various different things, to where people see injustices in this country and they want to do something about it, because all men are supposed to be created equal, right? Except that doesn't extend to everybody. Not exactly, at least. And so that's where the ongoing conversations need to happen about how we truly make things equal for everybody, so that all men can truly be equal, but really all people can be equal. Okay? But it has to start somewhere, and it has to start with the idea of, okay, recognizing that Native Americans at this time are about to be largely displaced. You still have a very large African population that's going to be enslaved, and women still don't have a say in government. So there were even people who wanted to push back against letting women have rights and votes, and what do you do about slavery? We've talked about that. Okay, so there were questions about the realities of inequality at that time, but nonetheless, you still have the idea of all men are created equal that serves as a foundation for American belief and thought to this day. That being said, as far as the states were concerned, you do have some states like Connecticut and Rhode Island who basically wanted to follow this idea of republicanism even as they were colonies. All they had to do was just kind of remove Britain from any of their documents, and they basically had a form where they had an executive that had limited powers and people had more say in statewide to-do. So there were new documents that had to be created by these other states. So Connecticut and Rhode Island really largely wrote out the first state constitutions that would be more in Republican form, okay? And they largely eliminated the over extreme powers of an executive like a governor. Also, you have legislatures that would now be developed that would have a bicameral aspect to them, which means that they would have a lower house and an upper house, or an upper chamber or a lower chamber, okay? So, like the Texas legislature has a House of Representatives, it also has a Senate, much like our federal government. We're going to talk about that later on. Okay? So you need a bicameral legislature for there to be more truly of a Republican form, and more representation that reaches all corners of the state and whatnot. And that was recognized at this point. And it would have to also be recognized that as constitutions would be ratified around this time, that there would have to be larger discussions about what is best for each individual state, and other regional aspects that perhaps make the state stand out, or various different cultural announcements or anything else of that sort that would make documentation of their state constitutions more worthy. So, state legislatures could often amend constitutions. There would have to be something done about that, so as to not abuse constitutional authority. So Massachusetts, for example, came together with the state assembly to discuss specifically the purpose of writing a constitution. And it would be difficult to amend it without large consent. Hold that thought, because that just might set a precedent. Okay. Some states decided, you know what, we can actually strengthen the power of an executive like a governor, as long as we still have some sort of balance within it to kind of check this executive. So we want this governor, this executive, to have veto power to make appointments and things along those lines, but we want to be able to kind of curb that as necessary, but we still want them to be powerful enough to be effective. So what you're seeing in Massachusetts is somewhat of a modern system of strong executive who's held in reasonable check. Sounds familiar. I wonder if that might apply somewhere else. Foreshadowing. Otherwise, though, there were people at this time that recognized that religion and government oftentimes intertwine. However, there is no direct state particular religion. Even though many colonies were founded as predominantly Church of England or by Puritans or Quakers, or you have Catholics allowed here, or whichever, or no particular state had a particular religion specifically associated. So it was deemed necessary at this time that there be more, in Virginia at least, a separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson himself recognized that, maybe since we don't have a state-sponsored religion, we should keep them separate. Constitutional clauses that separate religion and government. We're going to see that elsewhere in American history. Foreshadowing. Okay? So that discussion about separation of church and state begins with state constitutions, largely centering around Virginia and Massachusetts.